Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Montgomery, Alabama. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing what places and what times of day or night these documented stories reach. The year was 1852 when the name Thaddeus Pike first appeared in the Montgomery County records. A new arrival to the prosperous cotton trading city, Pike presented himself as a gentleman of means from Virginia, purchasing the old Whitfield estate on the eastern edge of town. The property had stood vacant for nearly 7 years following the unexplained departure of its previous owners. Pike was described in the county clerk's notes as a man of 43 years, unmarried, of stern countenance and particular habits. What drew attention was not his purchase of the estate, but rather the unusual conditions he had written into the deed, namely that the small cabin at the edge of the property was to remain undisturbed and uninhabited for the duration of his ownership. Within 2 months of his arrival, Pike had established himself among Montgomery's elite, hosting elaborate dinners where the city's most influential families would gather. Yet those who attended noted a peculiar tension in their host. James Holloway, whose family owned the largest textile mill in the county, wrote in his personal journal dated April 18, 1852, "Mr. Pike conducts himself with the appropriate manners of a gentleman, yet there remains something in his gaze that suggests a man perpetually waiting for news he does not wish to receive." It was at one such gathering in May that Thaddeus Pike first introduced Miss Magnolia Claret. According to multiple accounts recorded in letters and diary entries from that evening, Miss Claret appeared suddenly beside Pike during dinner, though no one recalled seeing her arrive. Described as a woman of unusual beauty, with complexion suggesting mixed ancestry, though none dared remark upon it openly, Magnolia Claret was presented as Pike's ward, the daughter of a deceased business associate from New Orleans, whom he had taken under his protection. This arrangement raised eyebrows throughout Montgomery society, but given Pike's wealth and growing influence, few questions were asked aloud. The Montgomery Daily Advertiser from May 28, 1852, mentioned the pair briefly. Mr. Pike and his ward, Miss Claret, were in attendance at the governor's ball, the lady's exotic appearance drawing considerable attention. What followed over the next 11 months was, by all documented accounts, a period of apparent normalcy. Pike continued his business dealings, primarily in cotton and shipping interests along the Alabama River. Miss Claret was seen regularly in his company at social functions, though always maintaining a careful distance in public. Several observers noted that while she spoke freely with Pike, she rarely engaged with others, unless directly addressed. This facade of propriety might have continued indefinitely had it not been for the events of April 9, 1853. According to sheriff's records discovered during renovations of the Montgomery County Courthouse in 1962, a late-night disturbance was reported at the Pike estate. The report, written in the shaky hand of Deputy William Garner, states, "Summoned to the Pike residence at approximately 11 in the evening. Upon arrival, found the house in darkness. Mr. Pike answered after considerable delay, denying any disturbance and refusing entry. Noted what appeared to be blood on his cuff, which he attributed to a hunting accident earlier in the day. The following Sunday, Pike and Magnolia Claret attended services at First Presbyterian Church as usual. Reverend Thomas Whitley noted in his weekly reflection that Mr. Pike sat unusually rigid throughout the sermon on Exodus, while Miss Claret, normally composed, appeared to weep silently during the reading of the scripture. 3 days later, on April 13th, Thaddeus Pike was seen leaving Montgomery on the early morning riverboat bound for Mobile. What raised immediate concern was that he traveled alone. By afternoon, when Pike had not returned and Miss Claret had not been seen, the housekeeper, Sarah Blackwell, alerted neighbours. A search of the estate revealed nothing unusual, except that Miss Claret's few personal belongings remained undisturbed in her room. Most notably, a silver hairbrush, reportedly a gift from Pike, lay on her dressing table alongside a half-written letter addressed simply to Mother. The initial assumption throughout Montgomery was that Pike had taken Miss Claret on an unannounced trip. This theory collapsed when Pike returned alone 3 days later, claiming no knowledge of Magnolia's whereabouts and expressing what witnesses described as theatrical concern for his ward. A formal investigation was reluctantly initiated by Sheriff Thomas Morris, a known associate of Pike's and frequent guest at his dinner table. The cursory investigation concluded that Miss Claret had likely fled of her own accord, possibly to New Orleans to reconnect with her mother's family. This explanation was accepted by most of Montgomery society, eager to avoid scandal. Had the matter ended there, the names Thaddeus Pike and Magnolia Claret might have faded from memory. However, a chance discovery in October of 1853 altered the narrative entirely. According to courthouse records, a group of fishermen working along the Alabama River discovered a woman's shawl caught in their nets approximately 4 miles south of Montgomery. The shawl was identified by Sarah Blackwell as belonging to Miss Claret. This discovery prompted a reluctant Sheriff Morris to reopen his investigation. During this second inquiry, several previously undisclosed facts emerged. The cabin that Pike had insisted remain undisturbed was found to contain personal items belonging to a woman, clothing of fine quality, letters in French, and a small portrait of a woman bearing a striking resemblance to Magnolia Claret, though appearing somewhat older. The painting was dated 1837 and signed simply C.L. More damning was the testimony of Jeremiah Watson, a stable hand who had been dismissed from Pike's employ in May. Watson claimed that in late March he had observed Pike and Miss Claret in what appeared to be a lover's quarrel near the cabin. According to his sworn statement, Miss Claret spoke with unusual authority, stating, "You cannot deny what is written. What God has joined cannot be undone by man's law." To which Mr. Pike replied, "There are ways to ensure silence." Despite these revelations, the investigation stalled once again. Sheriff Morris concluded that insufficient evidence existed to implicate Pike in any wrongdoing. The matter might have rested there permanently had it not been for the arrival of Jean-Baptiste Claret in Montgomery in December of 1853. Identifying himself as Magnolia's uncle from New Orleans, Claret presented documentation suggesting that Magnolia had never been Pike's ward at all, but rather his legal wife. According to marriage records from St. Louis Cathedral in New Orleans, dated 1847, Thaddeus Pike had married Magnolia Devereux, her birth name, 5 years before their appearance in Montgomery. Jean-Baptiste Claret further alleged that his niece had written to him expressing fear for her safety after discovering Pike's involvement in illegal activities. The nature of these activities was never clearly established, though Claret intimated they involved the forging of documents related to property ownership. Pike vehemently denied these allegations, producing papers showing that the real Magnolia Devereux had died of fever in 1848. He claimed that the woman known in Montgomery as Magnolia Claret was an impostor attempting to claim connection to a prominent New Orleans family. The confusion might have continued indefinitely had Sheriff Morris not finally agreed to have the cabin on Pike's property thoroughly searched. According to the official report filed on December 23, 1853, what they discovered beneath the floorboards was not Magnolia's body as many had begun to suspect, but rather a collection of documents. These papers included multiple identity records for Thaddeus Pike himself, suggesting he had operated under at least 3 different names across Virginia, Louisiana, and Mississippi over the preceding 15 years. Most disturbing was a journal, apparently belonging to the real Thaddeus Pike, with entries ending abruptly in 1851. The final entry read, "Suspect D knows more than he reveals about the discrepancies in the shipping manifests. Must confront him before departing for Montgomery." As news of these discoveries spread through Montgomery, Thaddeus Pike, or whoever he truly was, disappeared in the night, leaving behind the Whitfield estate and all its contents. A warrant was issued for his arrest, but no trace of him was ever officially recorded. The fate of Magnolia Claret remained unresolved until March of 1854, when workers clearing land along the river approximately 12 miles south of Montgomery uncovered human remains partially buried near the water's edge. The remains were identified as female, though definitive identification was impossible. Found nearby was a silver locket containing a small portrait matching the one found in the cabin, signed with the same initials, CL. The discovery prompted renewed interest in the case, with the Montgomery Courier publishing a detailed account on March 25, 1854. The article speculated openly about Pike's true identity and his relationship with the woman known as Magnolia Claret. Following the discovery of the remains, Jean-Baptiste Claret remained in Montgomery for several weeks, consulting with authorities and reportedly conducting his own investigation into his niece's disappearance. Before departing for New Orleans, he provided a written statement to the Montgomery Courier, parts of which were published in their April 11th edition. "The woman known here as Magnolia Claret was indeed my sister's daughter. Her mother, Cécile Laveau, was born free in New Orleans, but lived in constant fear of having her status challenged. The man calling himself Thaddeus Pike was known to us by another name entirely, and his crimes extend far beyond what has been discovered here. The investigation officially concluded in May of 1854, with authorities declaring that insufficient evidence existed to determine whether Pike was responsible for Magnolia's death. The case was closed. The remains were buried in an unmarked grave in the city cemetery, and Montgomery society gradually returned to its normal rhythms. For nearly 70 years, the story of Thaddeus Pike and Magnolia Claret faded from public memory, referenced occasionally in hushed conversations, but never officially revisited. This changed in 1923, when historian Margaret Wilkes began researching prominent Montgomery families for a planned book on Alabama society before the Civil War. While examining records at First Presbyterian Church, Wilkes discovered a collection of letters written by Reverend Thomas Whitley between 1852 and 1856. In one letter dated July 1854, Whitley wrote to a colleague in Richmond, "The truth of the Pike affair is far more disturbing than what has been publicly acknowledged. I have reason to believe, based on a deathbed confession I cannot in good conscience disclose, that the man was involved in a scheme to falsify documents of ownership, not merely of property, but of persons." The woman Claret threatened to expose this operation, which extended to families we count among our most respected citizens. Wilkes's research was abruptly abandoned after she reportedly received anonymous threats warning her against pursuing the Pike-Claret case further. Her notes and findings were donated to the Alabama Historical Society in 1927, but were catalogued under an unrelated classification and remained effectively hidden until 1968. In 1968, during renovations of the old Whitfield estate, by then known locally as Pike's Folly, workers discovered a hidden space beneath the main staircase. Inside was a metal box containing what appeared to be personal papers belonging to the woman known as Magnolia Claret. Among these was a journal written primarily in French, with the final entry dated April 8, 1853. One day before the reported disturbance at the Pike estate, the journal was acquired by the Montgomery Historical Society, but was never fully translated or made public. According to Dr. James Thornton, who examined the documents in 1969, the final pages contained allegations that would cast several founding families of Montgomery in a light so unfavorable that publication would serve no historical purpose. What is known is that shortly after Dr. Thornton's assessment, the journal and associated materials were reported missing from the Historical Society's archives. An internal investigation concluded that the documents had been misplaced during cataloguing, though rumors persisted that they had been deliberately removed. The most recent development in the Pike Claret mystery came in 1965, when construction workers excavating for a new building approximately half a mile from the former Pike estate uncovered a sealed well containing various items dating to the mid-19th century. Among these was a man's pocket watch engraved with the initials TP. Inside the watch was a folded paper containing what appeared to be a coded message. Despite attempts by cryptographers at Auburn University, the message has never been fully deciphered. The case of Thaddeus Pike and Magnolia Claret remains one of Montgomery's most enduring mysteries. Was Pike an impostor who murdered his ward to protect his true identity? Was Magnolia Claret truly his wife, threatening to expose his crimes? Or were they both players in a larger conspiracy involving some of Montgomery's most prominent families? What is perhaps most troubling is how quickly and effectively the story was suppressed. Within months of Pike's disappearance, mentions of the case vanished from local newspapers. Family records from the period show curious gaps, and certain names appear to have been deliberately removed from church registries and social records. Today, the land where the Whitfield estate once stood remains undeveloped, despite its prime location. Local residents report an unusual reluctance among developers to purchase the property, though official explanations cite drainage issues and soil instability. Perhaps the final word on the Pike Claret mystery comes from a letter discovered in 1962 among the personal effects of Judge William Holloway, grandson of James Holloway, who had known Pike personally. The letter, apparently written but never sent, was addressed to the Montgomery Historical Society and dated 1924, shortly after Margaret Wilkes began her ill-fated research. It reads, in part, "I feel compelled by conscience to reveal what my grandfather confided to my father and he to me regarding the truth of the Pike affair. There are names involved whose descendants continue to wield influence in our state. The woman was indeed Magnolia Claret Devereux, legally wedded to the man we knew as Pike, though that was not his true name. Their presence in Montgomery was no accident, but part of an organized effort to locate and recover certain documents that threatened to expose the illegitimate acquisition of both property and persons by several prominent families. When she threatened to expose not just Pike but the entire operation, her fate was decided not by one man, but by a consortium of Montgomery's elite. The remains found by the river were indeed hers, but the circumstances of her death involve more hands than history has recorded. The letter was never delivered. Judge Holloway died 3 days after writing it, reportedly of natural causes. The letter remained sealed among his personal papers for nearly 40 years. Those who visit Montgomery's old city cemetery sometimes report seeing fresh flowers placed on the unmarked grave, believed to contain Magnolia's remains. Cemetery records show no living descendants or known relatives, and the identity of the visitor remains unknown. The shadows cast by the Pike Claret affair continue to stretch across Montgomery's history, a reminder that beneath the veneer of Southern gentility and historical romance often lie darker truths, truths that powerful interests have repeatedly sought to keep buried. Like the coded message in Pike's pocket watch, some secrets remain deliberately indecipherable, protected by time and the collective will to forget. Perhaps that is why, to this day, the area where the cabin once stood remains conspicuously empty. A grassy depression in the landscape that local children instinctively avoid. Some stories, it seems, refuse to remain completely buried, no matter how carefully they are hidden away. As for the ultimate fate of the man calling himself Thaddeus Pike, no definitive record exists. A passenger manifest from a ship departing Mobile for Havana in January 1854 lists a T. Pickering, whose physical description matches Pike's. Whether he escaped justice entirely or met his own end in some foreign land remains unknown. The truth of what happened between Thaddeus Pike and Magnolia Claret on the night of April 9th, 1853, died with them. What survives is not justice or resolution, but rather the whispered echoes of a story Montgomery has never fully confronted, a story about identity, deception, and the terrible price of silence. In 1959, during a severe drought, the Alabama River receded to historically low levels, revealing portions of the riverbed not seen in living memory. Among the debris exposed was a small silver key, later determined to date from the mid-19th century. Engraved on the key's head was a single word, veritas, Latin for truth. Whether this artifact had any connection to the Pike Claret case cannot be determined, but it was found less than a quarter mile from where Magnolia's remains were discovered over a century earlier. The key was donated to the Montgomery Historical Society, where it remained on display until 1962, when it disappeared during a renovation of the Society's building. Like so many pieces of this puzzle, it vanished without explanation, leaving behind only questions that may never be answered. Today, the story of Thaddeus Pike and Magnolia Claret is rarely mentioned in official histories of Montgomery. No historical markers commemorate the events that unfolded at the Whitfield estate. No official tour guides direct visitors to the site where the cabin once stood. It is as if the city itself has collectively decided that some stories are better left untold. Yet for those who know where to look, in the gaps between official records, in the strange silences that punctuate family histories, in the peculiar reluctance to develop certain parcels of land, the outlines of the truth remain visible. Like the hidden compartment beneath the staircase where Magnolia's journal was found, Montgomery's history contains secret spaces where uncomfortable truths lie concealed, waiting for someone with the courage to bring them into the light. Whether that day will ever come remains to be seen. Until then, the mystery of Thaddeus Pike and Magnolia Claret continues to echo across time, a distant reminder that history is written not only by what is recorded, but also by what is deliberately omitted. In the words of Judge Holloway's undelivered letter, some silences speak louder than any confession. Montgomery's most guarded secret is not what happened to one woman on one night in 1853, but rather what her story reveals about the foundations upon which our society was built. Perhaps that is why the story persists, despite repeated efforts to suppress it. Some truths refuse to remain buried, no matter how deep the grave. In the summer of 1961, an elderly woman named Eleanor Jenkins contacted the Montgomery Historical Society, claiming to be a descendant of Jean-Baptiste Claret. According to society records, Jenkins presented a collection of family letters suggesting that Magnolia Claret had indeed been married to Thaddeus Pike in New Orleans, but that their union had been deliberately concealed due to the complexities of her heritage and legal status. The most compelling document in Jenkins' collection was a letter reportedly written by Jean-Baptiste Claret to his sister in France, dated February 1854. In it, he described his investigation in Montgomery following Magnolia's disappearance, I have spoken with those who served in the Pike household, and their accounts differ dramatically from the official narrative. The housekeeper, Sarah Blackwell, confided to me that on the morning of April 9th, she observed Mr. Pike and Magnolia in heated conversation near the main staircase. Magnolia was seen holding documents which she claimed would restore what had been wrongfully taken. By evening, these documents had vanished, as had Magnolia herself. Jenkins allowed the Historical Society to make copies of select letters, but refused to donate the originals, citing concerns about their safety. 3 weeks after her visit, Jenkins' home in Mobile was reportedly broken into, though police records indicate nothing of value was stolen. Jenkins herself relocated shortly thereafter, leaving no forwarding address. Attempts by the Historical Society to contact her again were unsuccessful. In 1963, Professor Raymond Thornton of the University of Alabama began researching property records in Montgomery County from 1850 to 1860 for a study on pre-Civil War land transactions. During his investigation, Thornton uncovered a curious pattern involving several properties adjacent to the Pike estate. According to his findings, all had changed ownership within 18 months of Pike's arrival in Montgomery, with the new deeds containing nearly identical language regarding mineral rights and water access. More significantly, Thornton discovered that the man who sold the Whitfield estate to Thaddeus Pike, a Thomas Caldwell of Savannah, appeared to have no prior connection to the property. The previous owners, the Whitfield family, had reportedly sold the estate to a bank consortium in 1845 following financial difficulties. How Caldwell acquired the property from this consortium remained unclear, as no record of such a transaction existed in the county archives. Thornton's research notes, housed in the University of Alabama's special collections, include this observation. The more closely one examines the property transactions surrounding the Pike case, the more obvious it becomes that conventional records were being manipulated. What remains unclear is whether Pike was a perpetrator of this scheme, or perhaps someone who had discovered it and was subsequently silenced. Thornton published a brief paper on irregularities in Montgomery property records in the Journal of Southern History in 1964, but made no specific mention of the Pike case, referring only to certain anomalies suggesting organized manipulation of property transfers during the period in question. When asked years later why he had not pursued the matter further, Thornton reportedly replied, "Some doors are best left unopened, particularly when the foundations of entire family legacies rest on what lies behind them." The connection between property manipulation and Magnolia's disappearance might never have been established had it not been for the discovery of a cache of documents during renovations to the Montgomery County Courthouse in 1966. Hidden within a sealed wall cavity were several ledgers dating from 1852 to 1854, apparently recording transactions not meant for official registries. The ledgers, examined briefly by county historian Marianne Phillips before they were transferred to the State Archives in Birmingham, contained what appeared to be a shadow accounting system for property transfers. According to Phillips' notes, several entries referenced the Whitfield situation and a claret problem requiring permanent resolution. Most tellingly, an entry dated April 10th, 1853, the day after the reported disturbance at the Pike estate, referenced a payment of $500 to a Deputy G for discretion regarding Riverside matters. By the time researchers from the State Archives arrived to collect the ledgers, county officials reported that they had been damaged by water from a burst pipe and were largely illegible. The few pages that survived were heavily redacted before being made available to the public, with officials citing privacy concerns related to living descendants. In 1967, Construction began on a new county administration building on land adjacent to where the Pike estate had stood. During excavation, workers uncovered what appeared to be the foundation of a small structure approximately 50 yards from where the cabin had been located. Among the debris was a metal box containing a woman's glove, a lock of dark hair tied with blue ribbon, and a folded document bearing a notary's seal from New Orleans. The document, dated 1847, was a bill of sale for a woman identified only as M to one Thaddeus Pike. What made this discovery particularly disturbing was that the document appeared to have been altered, with the words "bill of sale" written over what forensic analysis later suggested had been manumission papers, documents granting freedom to an enslaved person. This discovery lent credence to a theory that had begun to circulate among historians, that Magnolia Claret may have been a free woman of color from New Orleans, whose status Pike had attempted to reverse through document falsification, perhaps as part of a larger scheme involving several Montgomery families. The document was sent to the Alabama Department of Archives and History for preservation, but was reported lost in transit. In 1968, an article appeared in the small scholarly journal Historical Reconsiderations titled "Document Falsification and Identity Manipulation in the Antebellum South." The author, identified only as a Montgomery observer, presented evidence suggesting that several prominent Montgomery families had participated in a systematic effort to falsify property and personal records during the 1850s, with a particular focus on obscuring the free status of certain individuals of mixed heritage. No investigation into its disappearance was ever conducted. The article specifically referenced the Pike Claret case, suggesting that the woman known as Magnolia Claret may have possessed documentation proving not only her own free status, but that of several other individuals claimed as property by certain Montgomery families. Her elimination, therefore, served not merely one man's interests, but those of an entire power structure built upon fraudulent claims to both land and persons. The journal ceased publication shortly after this issue, citing financial difficulties. Attempts to contact the anonymous author through the editorial board proved unsuccessful. Throughout the 1970s, the Pike Claret case remained largely forgotten, mentioned occasionally in scholarly works on document falsification or property fraud in the pre-Civil War South, but never subjected to comprehensive investigation. This changed briefly in 1978 when novelist Catherine Beaumont announced plans to publish a fictionalized account of the case titled The Magnolia Deception. According to interviews Beaumont gave to several literary magazines, her research had uncovered evidence suggesting that Thaddeus Pike had been an agent working for a network of wealthy Southern families, engaged in systematically claiming free people of color as enslaved property through document falsification. Magnolia, according to Beaumont's theory, had been Pike's wife and initially his accomplice, but had experienced a change of heart and planned to expose the operation. 2 weeks before the manuscript was due to be submitted to her publisher, Beaumont's home in Atlanta was destroyed in a fire that claimed her life. Investigators ruled the fire accidental, citing faulty wiring. Beaumont's research materials and manuscript were completely destroyed, according to the official report. However, in 1981, a former colleague of Beaumont's, Professor Helen Marshall of Emory University, claimed in a private letter to historian John Bennett that Beaumont had sent her copies of key documents related to the Pike Claret case shortly before her death. According to Marshall, these included a partial translation of Magnolia's journal found at the Pike estate and correspondence between several Montgomery families, discussing the need to secure all evidence related to the Pike matter following his disappearance. Marshall reportedly planned to publish an academic paper based on these materials, but died of a sudden stroke before completing the work. Her personal papers, including any copies of the Beaumont materials, were disposed of by relatives unfamiliar with their significance. The trail of evidence in the Pike Claret case went cold for nearly 2 decades until 2002, when renovations to St. John's Episcopal Church in Montgomery uncovered a sealed compartment beneath the vestry floor. Inside was a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be the personal papers of Reverend Samuel Whitmore, who had served as rector from 1850 to 1862. Among these papers was a confidential letter from Sheriff Thomas Morris to Reverend Whitmore, dated May 1854. In it, Morris confessed to deliberately mishandling the investigation into Magnolia's disappearance, writing, "I acted not merely out of friendship to certain parties involved, but out of concern for the stability of our community. The documentation the woman possessed would have cast doubt upon the ownership of nearly 1/3 of the productive land in this county, and the status of numerous persons currently held as property. The consequences of such revelations would have been nothing short of catastrophic for Montgomery society." Church officials transferred the Whitmore papers to the Alabama Department of Archives and History. However, when researchers requested access to the collection, they were informed that certain documents, including the Morris letter, had been deemed too fragile for public examination and placed in restricted storage. Requests for conservation and digitization were denied due to budgetary constraints. In 2007, documentary filmmaker Rachel Jenkins, claiming to be a descendant of Eleanor Jenkins, who had approached the Historical Society in 1961, began researching the Pike Claret case for a planned film titled Buried Truths: The Magnolia Claret Mystery. During her research, Jenkins attempted to locate the unmarked grave in the Old City Cemetery, where Magnolia's remains had supposedly been interred. Working from historical records and ground-penetrating radar, Jenkins and her team identified what they believed to be the location. With permits from city officials, a limited archaeological investigation was conducted. What they discovered was not a human burial, but rather a small lead box containing a single item: a marriage certificate dated January 15, 1847, recording the union of Thaddeus Pike and Magnolia Devereux at St. Louis Cathedral in New Orleans. Most significantly, the certificate identified Magnolia as a free woman of color and was signed by Father Jean Dumont, whose name appeared in church records as assistant pastor at the cathedral during that period. Jenkins submitted the certificate for authentication to experts at Tulane University, who confirmed that the paper, ink, and official seals were consistent with documents from the period. However, before Jenkins could incorporate this finding into her documentary, she reported receiving anonymous threats warning her to abandon the project. When these threats escalated to include her family members, Jenkins reluctantly shelved the film indefinitely. The marriage certificate was donated to the Montgomery Historical Society, but was displayed only briefly before being removed from exhibition due to what the curator described as conservation concerns. In 2012, historian Marcus Thompson published an article in the Journal of Southern Legal History examining cases of identity and status manipulation in pre-Civil War Alabama. Without specifically naming the Pike Claret case, Thompson described a pattern whereby certain individuals with specialized knowledge of legal documentation systems operated across state lines to alter the recorded status of free persons of color, effectively re-enslaving them through paper manipulation. Thompson noted that this practice was particularly prevalent in cases involving valuable property claims, where the sudden discovery that claimants of African descent held legal title could be remedied through the strategic disappearance of both persons and papers. Following the article's publication, Thompson reportedly received an anonymous package containing a single page, apparently torn from Magnolia's journal. The page, written in French and dated March 1853, contained a passage that, when translated, read, "T has finally admitted his true purpose in bringing me to this place. The documents I secured from his desk confirm what I have long suspected, that he has been employed by the H&M families to falsify records of ownership. What he does not know is that I have made copies of these papers and entrusted them to J, with instructions to make them public should any harm come to me." Thompson attempted to locate the complete journal, but found that all official records of its discovery had been removed from Historical Society archives. When he published a follow-up article mentioning the anonymous journal page, he was contacted by university administrators and strongly encouraged to pursue less contentious areas of research. The most recent development in the Pike Claret mystery occurred in 2016, when construction workers, preparing a site for a new office building approximately half a mile from where the Pike estate had stood, uncovered what appeared to be a small underground chamber. Inside was a metal strongbox sealed with multiple locks. County officials took possession of the box and, after considerable public pressure, arranged for its opening in a controlled setting witnessed by representatives from several historical organizations. Inside were dozens of documents, many severely damaged by moisture, but some still legible. Among the preserved papers was a letter signed by Thaddeus Pike, dated April 8, 1853. One day before the reported disturbance at his estate. Addressed to an unnamed associate, the letter read in part, "M has discovered the true nature of our enterprise and threatens exposure. She has obtained copies of the adjusted titles and registries, including those related to her own status. Most disturbing is her claim to have secreted these documents with a confidant who will make them public in the event of her disappearance. I fear our entire operation is at risk unless decisive action is taken immediately." Also included was a partial list of names with amounts written beside them, suggesting payments or allocations. Several of the surnames corresponded to prominent Montgomery families of the period, including individuals who had served as judges, legislators, and business leaders. Most significantly, the box contained fragments of what appeared to be the missing pages from Magnolia's journal. Though much of the text was illegible due to water damage, certain passages remained readable, including one dated April 9, 1853. "I have confronted T with what I know. The look in his eyes confirmed my worst fears. I have little time. If these words are found after I'm gone, know that what was done to me was not the act of one man alone, but of many whose names are recorded in the documents I have hidden, where even T cannot find them." Following the discovery, county officials announced that the documents would be transferred to the Alabama Department of Archives and History for preservation and eventual public access. However, before this transfer could occur, a fire broke out in the county records room where the materials were being temporarily stored. Officials reported that the Pike documents were completely destroyed, though miraculously no other historical records suffered significant damage. In the years since this incident, no new physical evidence in the Pike Claret case has come to light. However, the pattern of discoveries followed by convenient disappearances has led some historians to suggest that powerful interests continue to monitor and suppress information related to the case. As historian Rebecca Johnson noted in her 2018 book, Silenced Histories, Suppressed Narratives of the American South, the Pike Claret case represents not merely an unsolved historical mystery, but a window into the active and ongoing process by which certain narratives are systematically excluded from our historical consciousness. The repeated pattern of evidence emerging only to vanish again suggests not random loss, but deliberate suppression. Today, the land where the Whitfield estate once stood remains largely undeveloped, a rare empty space in Montgomery's otherwise densely built landscape. Local tradition holds that the property is cursed, though real estate developers cite more practical concerns such as soil instability and drainage issues. Visitors to Montgomery rarely hear the names Thaddeus Pike or Magnolia Claret mentioned on historical tours. No plaques commemorate their story. No exhibits in local museums explore the evidence that has accumulated over nearly 170 years. Yet in certain academic circles, the case continues to represent one of the most compelling examples of historical suppression. A story deliberately erased because its implications threaten to undermine accepted narratives about property, power, and race in the antebellum South. Perhaps most telling is that even now, attempts to conduct comprehensive research on the Pike Claret case frequently encounter unexpected obstacles: missing archival materials, restricted access to relevant collections, and in some cases, pressure from unnamed sources to abandon such research altogether. As one Montgomery archivist reportedly told a researcher in 2019, "Some stories in this town come with warnings. The Pike Claret matter tops that list. I've worked here 30 years and watched at least a dozen serious researchers walk away from that case, not because they lost interest, but because they lost their nerve." The ultimate fate of Thaddeus Pike remains unknown. No definitive record of his death exists in any state or federal archive. Similarly, while physical evidence strongly suggests that Magnolia Claret met a violent end, the circumstances of her death and the identities of those responsible have never been conclusively established. What remains instead is a ghostly outline of a story with profound implications. A story about the manipulation of identity, the falsification of documents, and a conspiracy that may have involved some of Montgomery's most respected families in a scheme to claim both land and people through fraudulent means. Perhaps that is why the story continues to resist being fully uncovered. Too many powerful narratives about family legacies, about wealth legitimately acquired, about the very foundations of Southern society, depend upon keeping certain truths permanently buried. And so the mystery of Thaddeus Pike and Magnolia Claret persists, not as a fully formed narrative with beginning, middle, and end, but as a series of fragments, glimpses, and whispers. Like the coded message in Pike's pocket watch or the water-damaged pages of Magnolia's journal, the truth remains tantalizingly present but deliberately obscured. For those who continue to investigate despite the obstacles, the central questions remain. Who was Thaddeus Pike really? What documents did Magnolia possess that made her so dangerous? And perhaps most importantly, who benefits from ensuring this story remains untold? As Jean-Baptiste Claret wrote in his final letter before returning to New Orleans in 1854, "I leave Montgomery having found not my niece, but rather a conspiracy of silence so complete that it can only have been orchestrated by those with everything to lose should the truth emerge. I carry with me the conviction that Magnolia's voice will someday be heard, though perhaps not in my lifetime. Some truths cannot be permanently silenced, no matter how many powerful men wish them so. 171 years later, that silence largely remains unbroken. The Whitfield estate is gone, its foundations buried beneath years of accumulated soil and vegetation. The cabin where Magnolia may have hidden her documents has long since been demolished, its exact location lost to memory. The river where her remains were discovered continues to flow, carrying its secrets toward the Gulf of Mexico. Yet for those who know where to look, in the gaps between official records, in the strange patterns of disappeared evidence, in the persistent rumors that still circulate among certain families, the outlines of the truth remain visible. Like the hidden compartment beneath the staircase where Magnolia's journal was found, Montgomery's history contains secret spaces where uncomfortable truths lie concealed, waiting for someone with the courage to bring them into the light. In the spring of 2020, a graduate student researching her thesis on document falsification in the pre-Civil War South discovered an overlooked reference in the private papers of Judge William Holloway. The note, scribbled in the margin of an 1854 legal brief, read simply, "Pike matter resolved. All documents secured. MC case closed permanently per agreement with TM." The initials TM presumably referred to Sheriff Thomas Morris, suggesting that the judicial and law enforcement systems had cooperated in suppressing evidence related to the case. More disturbing was the implication that some form of agreement had been reached, that the truth had been deliberately buried as part of a negotiated arrangement among Montgomery's power structure. The student attempted to include this finding in her thesis, but was advised by her academic supervisor to focus on less speculative aspects of her research. The reference was ultimately omitted from her published work. And so the pattern continues. Fragments of truth emerging briefly before being submerged once again beneath the weight of tradition, reputation, and power. The story of Thaddeus Pike and Magnolia Claret remains what it has always been, a ghost story in the most literal sense, the tale of a woman whose voice was silenced and whose truth was buried, but whose presence continues to haunt the historical consciousness of a city built on carefully maintained narratives. For those who visit Montgomery today, there is little to suggest that this mystery ever existed. The old city cemetery where Magnolia's remains were reportedly interred has been renovated multiple times, with many unmarked graves relocated or built over. The Alabama River has been dredged and redirected, its banks reinforced with concrete in many places. The site where the Whitfield estate once stood is now partly occupied by a nondescript office park, its history erased beneath asphalt and landscaping. Yet occasionally, someone places flowers on what local tradition identifies as Magnolia's grave, though no marker confirms this location. Occasionally, a researcher stumbles upon a reference to the case in some overlooked archive and begins asking questions that make certain people uncomfortable. Occasionally, the story resurfaces, like the hidden documents revealed during floods or construction projects, refusing to remain completely forgotten. Perhaps that is Magnolia's final revenge against those who silenced her, that her story, fragmentary and incomplete as it is, continues to resist total erasure. That despite nearly 2 centuries of active suppression, the questions she raised about identity, documentation, and the foundations of property ownership in the antebellum South continue to unsettle those who prefer their history neatly packaged and morally uncomplicated. In the words of historian Rebecca Johnson, the Pike Claret case reminds us that historical silence is never neutral or accidental. It is actively produced and maintained. The gaps in our historical record are not simply missing information. They are information that has been deliberately removed because it threatened to undermine the narratives upon which power is built. And so the mystery endures, not despite attempts to suppress it, but because of them. Each act of suppression, each convenient fire, each misplaced document, each researcher pressured to look elsewhere, only underscores the significance of what Magnolia knew and what so many have worked so hard to keep hidden. The truth may never be fully known. The documents Magnolia allegedly hid may never be found. The names of those who orchestrated her disappearance may never be conclusively established. But the shadow her story casts continues to lengthen across Montgomery's carefully manicured historical landscape, a persistent reminder that beneath the surface of accepted narratives lie other truths, truths that, like Magnolia herself, refuse to remain conveniently buried.